Nothing is broken. Nothing is collapsing. Nothing is missing. This world is fully assembled. The sky is above. The ground is below. Direction exists. Structure exists. And yet, if you existed here, you would never be born. Not because something forbids birth. Not because existence resists creation. But because there is nowhere for birth to occur. The sky does not crush the ground. The ground does not reject the sky. They remain in uninterrupted contact. Everywhere, at all times. Continuity has become absolute. In such a world, nothing can arrive. Not because it is destroyed, but because arrival has no space. This is not a story about gods, or will, or conflict. This is the story of a universe that is too perfectly connected. A world that holds together so completely that nothing new can ever begin. And that is why this moment matters. Because this is the last stable configuration before existence must change. The sky exists. The ground exists. Orientation has appeared, but orientation alone does not create space. Above and below are positions, not distances. Uranus forms a ceiling, Gaia forms a base. Yet between them, there is no interval, no thickness, no depth. Contact is continuous, without pause, without relief. This world knows direction, but not separation. And without separation, structure cannot unfold. Everything remains pressed into presence, fully located, without extension. Nothing advances, nothing retreats. Existence stays exactly where it already is. This is not confinement. It is completion, a configuration that is fully assembled, but not yet capable of change. Continuity was once neutral. Now it is total. Nothing interrupts contact. Nothing interrupts presence. The sky touches the ground everywhere, at all times. There are no gaps, no margins, no breaks. Existence has no breathing room. When continuity becomes uninterrupted, change loses access. Not because change is destroyed, but because it has no surface to emerge from. Everything that could happen remains inside what already is. Potential does not disappear. It accumulates, held, compressed, contained. This is stability without release. A universe intact on the outside, saturated on the inside. Birth does not require intention or desire. Birth requires space, not emptiness, but availability. A condition where something can enter existence without replacing what already exists. In this world, that condition does not exist. The sky covers the ground completely. The ground supports the sky without interruption. There is no interval, no threshold, no margin. And without thresholds, nothing crosses. Birth is not delayed here. It is structurally impossible. Not because existence resists creation, but because creation has no location. Everything that could emerge remains contained within what already is. This is not suppression. This is saturation. Contact connects. It does not generate. Touching produces enclosure, not emergence. Creation does not arise from contact. It arises from spacing. Where there is no distance, there is no threshold. And without thresholds, nothing transitions. This world is continuous everywhere. So every location is already occupied by the same contact. Arrival cannot happen because arrival requires a difference between here and there, not a difference in meaning, a difference in structure. Contact makes everything adjacent, so nothing can become newly adjacent. In a fully touching world, the only possible state is persistence. Persistence is not growth. This is why the sky covering the ground is not an event. It is a configuration, and configuration determines what is possible. This structure does not fail. It holds. It holds without gaps, without leakage, without relief. Existence is perfectly retained, but retention is not continuation. A world can be stable and still be unable to proceed. When everything is held, nothing can be added. Not because addition is forbidden, but because addition has no place to stand. Holding eliminates openings. Openings are not weaknesses. They are functions. They allow entrance. They allow emergence. They allow the appearance of what was not present. This world has removed that function. So stability becomes a limit. Not a dramatic limit, a structural one. A configuration can be complete and still be incomplete as a system. Pressure appears when constraint becomes total. Not as violence, as consequence. When contact is uninterrupted, all possible release routes disappear. Nothing moves outward. Nothing moves inward. Yet accumulation still occurs. Because potential does not vanish, it remains present. Contained potential becomes pressure, not a push, a condition, a silent load stored inside continuity. Nothing signals it. No sound, no fracture, no visible strain. That is the danger of perfect containment. The world can appear calm while becoming structurally untenable. Pressure without motion is not action. It is inevitability, and inevitability does not announce itself. It simply approaches. This episode is about that approach. Time is not required for existence, but it is required for continuation. Continuation needs sequence. Sequence needs events. Events require thresholds. This world has none. So time has no reason to proceed. Not because time is absent, but because time has nothing to measure. Persistence becomes the only state. A stable configuration can repeat itself forever and still produce nothing. That is not eternity. It is stagnation. Duration without change is not progress. It is retention. And retention cannot be the final law. Because existence that cannot admit novelty eventually becomes inconsistent with its own possibility. A world that continues must allow arrival. Arrival requires space. Space requires separation. That chain is not optional. It is structural. An interval is not emptiness. It is a functional gap. A gap is where difference can appear. Difference is where novelty can enter. This world contains no intervals. Everything is filled by contact, not by matter, by configuration. When contact occupies every boundary, there is no boundary left to cross. When the sky touches the ground everywhere, there is no edge. Edges create entries. Entries create beginnings. Without edges, beginnings cannot occur. This is why a world can be complete and still be unable to start. Completeness is not the same as operability. Operability requires openings. Openings require non-contact. Non-contact is not absence. It is capability. This episode defines that capability by its absence. The universe now looks finished. Above exists. Below exists. A ceiling. A base. But appearance is not function. A closed configuration can preserve what exists, yet block what could exist. Function requires a pathway for change. Change requires a place for change to happen. This world provides none. It is like a structure with perfect alignment and zero clearance. Nothing breaks, but nothing can move. Nothing collapses, but nothing can be introduced. That is the paradox of total enclosure. The system performs stability and fails continuation. This is not a moral failure, not a choice. It is the consequence of a design with no intervals. And the only solution is structural, not personal. There is no resistance here, no opposing forces, no struggle, only contact. Conflict requires distance. Distance creates sides. Sides create opposition. This world has not produced sides. It has only produced continuity. So nothing can fight, because nothing can separate enough to become distinct. This matters because the later story will contain conflict. But conflict is not the beginning. The beginning is geometry. The beginning is configuration. The beginning is whether existence contains gaps. This episode is still before drama. It is before intention. It is a description of a limit that arrives without emotion. A world can reach a boundary without pain and still require transformation. Transformation begins as necessity, not as conflict, not yet. This is a limit of arrangement, not of substance. The sky and ground can exist and still fail to produce a working world, because a working world needs separations. Separations are not decorations. They are mechanisms. They create zones. Zones create transitions. Transitions create events. Events create sequence. Sequence creates the condition we later call time. In this configuration, sequence cannot initiate. So the system reaches its first true boundary, a boundary where persistence stops being neutral. Persistence becomes load. Load becomes demand. Demand becomes necessity. Nothing breaks at the boundary. It simply becomes impossible to remain unchanged. This is the definition of a structural limit. A point where the only continuation is reconfiguration. Continuity once protected existence. It prevented loss. It prevented rupture. But when continuity becomes total, it prevents arrival. A rule that once stabilized now obstructs the next step. This is how systems evolve, not by replacing what worked, but by exceeding it. A world with perfect contact is stable. But stability is not enough. Existence must also be generative. Generativity requires openings. Openings require distance. Distance requires a break in the total contact. Not a violent break, a functional one. This is why the sky covering everything cannot be the final configuration. Coverage must be limited, not because coverage is wrong, but because unlimited coverage eliminates emergence. And emergence is the condition of continuation. Nothing speaks in this world. There are no voices, no choices. Yet a demand exists, a demand created by structure. If existence is to continue, an outlet must appear, not as destruction, as allowance. Allowance is not permission. Allowance is geometry. A small interval, a minimal gap, a threshold. The system demands thresholds because without them, it cannot produce events. And without events, sequence cannot exist. This demand is silent because it is not emotional. It is computational. It is the inevitable result of a configuration that is too closed. A world can be calm and still be unsustainable. Sustainability requires the ability to add. To add, there must be space. So space becomes the next necessity. Separation is not conflict, it is clearance. Clearance is what allows a new state to exist alongside the current state. Without clearance, the only possible operation is persistence. This episode is defining why persistence is insufficient. Not philosophically, structurally. A minimal separation would create an interval. An interval would create a threshold. A threshold would allow crossing. Crossing would allow arrival. Arrival would allow birth. Birth would make continuation meaningful. This chain begins with one simple requirement, not an act. A condition that does not yet exist. So the world remains intact and simultaneously incomplete. This is the core paradox of the episode. Everything holds, and therefore nothing begins. To begin, the world must learn to separate. This moment is not an event, it is a readiness. The configuration has reached maximum closure. No cracks, no rupture. Yet the system is now dependent on change, because without change, continuation is impossible. This is the final stable configuration before a new rule appears. A new rule will not arrive as a character. It will arrive as capability. Capability to produce an interval. Capability to allow entry. Capability to permit the appearance of what was not present. Nothing needs to be destroyed for this. Only reconfigured. And reconfiguration is not drama. It is necessity. This episode ends at the edge of that necessity. The world is still closed, still continuous. But now, closure has become a limit. A limit that cannot be solved by persistence. Enclosure has reached its extreme. When enclosure becomes total, it becomes self-defeating, it preserves existence, and prevents continuation. A system cannot remain both fully closed and generative. Generativity requires entry points. Entry points require edges. Edges require non-contact. Non-contact requires separation. This is the limit, not a moral limit, a structural one. Beyond this point, nothing can be added, so continuation must transform into a new form. Not by undoing the sky, not by removing the ground, but by introducing a functional interval, a minimal distance that creates a threshold. The episode does not show the threshold forming. It only proves why it must. Because in a world without separation, birth is not delayed. Birth is impossible. Existence has reached a requirement. If the world is to continue, it must gain a new capability, not a new substance. A new rule, a rule that allows something to enter the world without displacing what already exists. That is what birth means in structural terms. Birth is not a story. It is an operation that requires space. So the next step is not conflict. It is permission for space to exist. A mechanism for separation, a minimal interval. Enough to create thresholds, enough to allow crossing, enough to allow arrival. When arrival becomes possible, continuation gains meaning, and only then does sequence have a function. Only then does time have a reason to proceed. This episode ends here. At the final proof, the world is intact, and therefore, it must change.